The sea has always been a keeper of secrets. In the spring of 1943, it would hold one that could change the fate of Europe. Somewhere, far from the smoke and thunder of the front lines, men in London prepared a deception so daring, so unlikely, that it bordered on madness. They would build a life for a man who never lived, send him to die a second time, and hope that Adolf Hitler himself would believe the lie. But in that moment, none of it was certain. The idea was fragile, grotesque, and riddled with risks. It could collapse under the weight of a single suspicion. Yet it was the only hope of saving tens of thousands of lives. London in 1943 was a city scarred but unbroken. At night, blackout curtains smothered the glow of lamps. Anti-aircraft guns pointed skyward, waiting for the Luftwaffe that no longer came as often, but still often enough to remind the people that the war was not distant. It was overhead. Streets bore the wounds of the Blitz, jagged gaps where houses had stood. Food was rationed. Cigarettes and tea had become the currency of survival. And in the middle of this battered capital, behind unmarked doors, Britain's secret war was being waged. MI5 headquarters did not look like the stage of history. From the outside, it was just another London office. Inside, smoke curled from endless cigarettes, typewriters clattered, and men in uniform hunched over maps and files. Here, deception was being refined into an art. Agents were turned and fed false information. Phantom divisions were created out of paper and imagination. But none of these schemes would be enough on their own to hide the Allies' next move. The problem was Sicily. The island was the natural stepping stone from North Africa to Italy. It was so obvious a target that even civilians could point to it on a map and guess what was coming. And that was the danger. If the Allies struck there directly, they would face a fortress. Hitler had poured men and guns onto Sicily. Every beach bristled with defenses. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, promised success only if the Germans could somehow be persuaded that it was not Sicily at all. Around a smoke-stained table, the question hung in the air. How do you make the obvious look like a trick? Among the files in those offices was an odd memorandum, written years earlier by Admiral John Godfrey. It was a catalogue of deception techniques, whimsical in parts, almost absurd in others, and it had been nicknamed the Trout Memo. It compared intelligence work to fishing. One must play out the line, offer tempting bait, and wait for the catch to take. Buried among its suggestions was one that made even hardened officers shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Plant false papers on a dead body and let it drift into enemy hands. Ewan Montague was the man who reached for that idea. He was a naval intelligence officer, sharp-minded and theatrical. Before the war, he had been a barrister, the kind of lawyer who relished clever twists and elaborate details. He loved the idea of stagecraft, and intelligence work gave him a stage on which the audience was the enemy. Alongside him was Charles Chumley, tall, awkward, and eccentric, with a gift for counter-espionage and a streak of wild imagination. Where Montague was meticulous, Chumley was daring. Together they began to spin the impossible into the possible. If they could find a body, they reasoned they could give it a name, a uniform, a story. And with that story would come documents, letters, notes, evidence, pointing the Germans away from Sicily. The challenge was not in the idea itself, but in making it believable. One flaw, one detail out of place, and the Germans would dismiss it as theater. The search for the body was delicate. Not just anyone would do. They needed someone whose cause of death could be explained, whose appearance would not raise questions, and whose identity could vanish without family or friends asking why. In a London morgue, they found him. Glynndwr Michael, a Welsh drifter, had died after consuming poison. He had no claimants, no relatives who might object. Forgotten in life, in death he could serve. But a uniform alone would not make him Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. He needed a past, fiancé, habits, a wallet filled with the meaningless clutter of everyday life. Montague called it wallet litter, but he handled it with reverence. They collected a photograph of a smiling young woman, actually an MI5 secretary, who would become Pam. They wrote letters from her, filled with tender words, folded and unfolded until the paper bore the creases of use. There were ticket stubs for a London play, receipts for trivial purchases, a stern note from a father demanding that Martin write more often. There were keys, cigarette packets, and even a bill from a tailor. Each piece was crafted to tell a story. A man alive, in love, moving through the ordinary rhythm of life. They aged the papers with smudges and stains. They tested ink to ensure it looked as though it had sat for weeks in a pocket. Every fingerprint was real, pressed by real hands, because Montague knew that German intelligence would look for the tiniest flaw. The crown of the illusion was the briefcase, a weathered leather case, chained to Martin's wrist, heavy with secrets. Inside were letters between Allied commanders. Their tone was casual, even dismissive. Sicily, they said, was merely a diversion. The real invasions would strike Greece and Sardinia. It was a perfect mixture of truth and falsehood, just enough to be believed, just enough to shift the enemy's gaze. The plan was grotesque. It was fragile. And yet, in the desperate spring of 1943, it was Britain's best hope. A dead man, carrying a briefcase of lies, was about to be sent into the sea to fool Hitler himself. The plan was ready on paper, but carrying it out required precision and silence. To deliver Major William Martin to the enemy, the British turned to the Royal Navy submarine HMS Seraph. She was a lean hunter of the deep, commanded by Lieutenant Norman Jewell, a man not much older than the men he commanded, but seasoned by years of silent warfare beneath the waves. Jewell was chosen not only for his skill but for his discretion. This was not a mission he could explain to his crew. Secrecy was part of survival. When the orders arrived, they were wrapped in euphemism. The crew of Seraph was told they were transporting a special meteorological device. No one asked questions. In wartime, strange assignments were routine. What they did not know was that sealed inside a steel canister, packed with dry ice, lay the body of WWII Michael, reborn as Major William Martin. On April 17, 1943, Seraph slipped out of Holy Loch, Scotland, into the grey Atlantic. The skies were low and heavy, and the sea rolled restlessly as if it knew the burden it carried. In the forward compartment, the canister sat strapped against the bulkhead. Frost formed on its surface, condensation dripping slowly to the floor. Men gave it wide berth, whispering about the strange chill it cast into the air. Jewell kept his silence. Only he and a select few in London knew what lay inside. Days at sea blurred into one another. The submarine crept south, its engines humming, its crew living in the narrow confines of steel corridors. The air was thick with oil, sweat, and the metallic tang of machinery. Condensation dripped from the ceiling, forming tiny rivulets on the men's bunks. Somewhere forward, hidden from their eyes, lay a man who had once been real, now transformed into the most unlikely courier in history. For nearly 2 weeks, Seraph prowled southward. They avoided known U-boat lanes, listened for the thrum of enemy destroyers, and endured the occasional thud of distant depth charges. Each sound reminded Jewell of the stakes. The canister preserved its secret only for so long. If the body thawed too soon, the illusion would crumble. Timing was everything. By late April, Seraph reached the waters off Spain. The coast of Huelva was chosen deliberately, a place where German influence was strongest, where WWII agents prowled under the mask of neutrality. If Major Martin washed ashore here, his case would almost certainly find its way into German hands. April 30th. The sea was black, the moon thin. At 4:30 in the morning, Jewel gathered his men on the deck. The canister was hauled up, its surface slick with frost. When the lid was broken open, a cloud of icy vapor poured out, wrapping the sailors in ghostly mist. Slowly, they lifted the figure within. Major William Martin emerged from the canister like an actor stepping onto the stage. His uniform was immaculate, the Royal Marines' insignia gleaming faintly in the moonlight. His face was pale, waxy, strangely peaceful. Chained to his wrist, the leather briefcase gleamed. The sailors, hardened by war, fell silent. They knew now that this was no device. This was something far more uncanny, and perhaps far more dangerous. Jewel read a short prayer. Then, with solemn care, the body was lowered into the waves. The tide caught it, pulling the figure slowly away from the submarine. For a moment it floated, rocking gently, then began its drift toward the Spanish coast. The men watched in silence. The ocean had claimed many of their comrades. Now it carried a man who had never lived, on a mission that might decide the fate of thousands who still did. Seraph slipped back beneath the waves, vanishing into the mist. Her mission was done. That morning, as the sun broke over the horizon, the fishermen of Huelva rowed their small wooden boats into the surf. The sea was calm, painted gold by the dawn. Gulls circled overhead. One fisherman spotted a dark shape drifting among the waves. At first he thought it was debris from some wreck. But as they drew nearer, the outline resolved into the form of a man. When they pulled the body aboard, they saw the uniform, the insignia, the case chained firmly to his wrist. Their voices fell to whispers. A dead officer delivered by the sea. They rowed him back to shore with care, half in fear, half in duty. The Spanish authorities took charge. The body was carried to a local hospital, the case examined but not opened. Official reports noted the drowned British officer, as though fate had chosen to deliver him to their coast. But Huelva was no ordinary Spanish town. German agents moved freely here, their presence barely disguised. Within hours, word of the discovery reached the WWII. In Madrid, pressure began at once. German officers pressed Spanish officials for access to the documents. Publicly, Spain claimed neutrality, insisting that the case was secure. Privately, behind closed doors, things were very different. Under the watchful eyes of German agents, the briefcase was opened. Papers were examined, copied, photographed. The chain of deception had moved to its most dangerous stage. In London, Montague and Chumley waited in silence. They had built Martin's life from scraps, invented a history out of nothing. Now their creation lay in a Spanish morgue, his briefcase in the hands of the enemy. Would the Germans believe the story, or would they see through the illusion, and in doing so expose the true Allied target? The next move belonged to Berlin. In Berlin, the photographs of the papers taken from Major William Martin's briefcase arrived with the urgency of treasure. Couriers carried them through guarded corridors to the desks of WWII officers. The men who unfolded the images were not fools. They had spent years dissecting enemy tricks, sniffing out misinformation. Yet as they bent over the pages, cigarette smoke curling in the air, they found themselves drawn into a story that felt both ordinary and convincing. The letters were written in a tone of careless routine, the kind of correspondence generals might exchange when they believed no one else would ever read them. They spoke of invasions in Greece and Sardinia with the ease of men sure of their plans. Sicily appeared only as a passing thought, described as a diversion to mislead German forces. It was exactly the kind of minor mention that gave weight to the larger claim. Still, suspicion was not absent. Some officers questioned the find. Could the British have planted such a body deliberately? Could they have hoped the Spaniards would pass the information on? The idea sounded almost too theatrical, too absurd to be true. Yet the details were so specific, so textured, that to dismiss them entirely risked ignoring a genuine opportunity. The debate rose to the highest levels. When the documents reached Hitler, they did not land on a neutral mind. They landed on fertile ground of pre-existing fear. For years, Hitler had been obsessed with Greece. He remembered the British intervention there in 1941. In his mind, the Balkans were a weak flank, a place where a clever enemy might unravel the Axis line. The documents confirmed his bias. They echoed his paranoia, and that was enough. Orders went out. Reinforcements were rushed to Greece. Sardinia bristled with new defenses. Panzer divisions shifted. Luftwaffe squadrons were redirected. Sicily, the fortress island that had consumed so much effort to fortify, was left weaker, a shell of the threat it might have posed. In London, Montagu and Cholmondeley learned through intercepted communications that their plan had succeeded. But success brought no celebration, only cautious relief. They had wagered the fate of an invasion on the believability of a dead man's pockets. And now, incredibly, Hitler had bitten the bait. July 9, 1943, the Allied invasion fleet approached Sicily under cover of darkness. Thousands of ships filled the horizon, their decks crowded with soldiers, their holds packed with tanks and supplies. The sea was rough, the wind sharp. For a moment, it seemed nature itself might ruin the operation. Yet as dawn approached, landing craft splashed into the waves, engines churning as they headed for shore. The men braced for a storm of fire. They imagined machine guns ripping across the sand, artillery shells hammering the waves, the beaches becoming slaughterhouses. Instead, resistance was scattered, uncoordinated, weaker than anyone had dared to hope. German troops were spread thin, their strength wasted in Greece and Sardinia. On Sicily, they were too few to hold back the tide. Within days, Allied forces had secured beachheads. Within weeks, the island fell. The gateway to Italy swung open. Mussolini's government collapsed under the shock. For the first time, Hitler's fortress Europe had been breached. And in the shadows behind that victory stood Operation Mincemeat, the deception of a corpse that shifted the balance of the war. Historians would later calculate that the operation had saved tens of thousands of lives. By tricking the Germans into weakening Sicily, the Allies shortened the campaign and reduced casualties. But beyond numbers, it was a triumph of imagination over brute force. A reminder that in war, truth can be shaped, and the strongest weapon may be belief. And what of the man himself? WWII Michael, who had died unknown in London, was buried in Huelva under the false name Major William Martin. His grave was honored with flowers, his headstone engraved with a name that had never belonged to him. For decades, the truth was hidden. Only in the late 20th century did historians uncover his real identity, and a second inscription was added to the stone. WWII Michael served as Major William Martin, Royal Marines. For Montagu, the operation became both a professional triumph and a haunting memory. He later wrote a book about it, though some details remained classified. Cholmondeley, the eccentric co-architect, faded quietly from public life, his brilliance remembered only by colleagues in the intelligence world. Lieutenant Jewell, who had read the prayer as the body slid into the sea, carried the secret for the rest of his career. The legacy of Operation Mincemeat extended far beyond 1943. It showed that deception, if crafted with patience and precision, could shape the destiny of armies. It became a lesson studied by intelligence agencies around the world. The Cold War would be filled with echoes of the strategy first tested on the shores of Spain. But in its essence, the operation remained a story both extraordinary and human. It was the story of a homeless man whose forgotten death was rewritten into legend, of two intelligence officers who saw possibility in the grotesque, of sailors who lowered a corpse into the sea, unsure if they were witnessing genius or madness, and of a dictator so blinded by his own fears that he mistook invention for truth. The sea has always kept its secrets. In 1943, it carried one ashore that fooled Adolf Hitler and changed the war. The man who never was saved those who were.